Let's begin with something that has not changed in 2,000 years. The moment someone in ancient Rome discovered they were pregnant, the immediate emotional response was complicated. Relief if the pregnancy was wanted, panic if it was not. Quiet calculation about resources, timing, and social consequences, regardless of which category it fell into. A mixture of hope and dread that any modern person would recognize immediately. What came after that moment, however, was a sequence of events so different from anything a modern person would experience that it requires some careful unpacking, because Roman pregnancy existed at the intersection of genuine medical knowledge, spectacular medical ignorance, elaborate superstition, hard social calculation, and the kind of practical problem-solving that emerges when you are facing a significant biological event with the tools available in the 1st century AD. Romans were not stupid. They were operating with the information they had. And some of what they believed, practiced, and prescribed for pregnancy was genuinely sophisticated. Some of it was the kind of thing that makes modern physicians close their eyes and take a slow breath. We are going to cover all of it. The first question a pregnant Roman woman faced was not how to stay healthy. It was whether the pregnancy would be acknowledged at all. Rome was a society in which the decision to raise a child was legally the father's. The paterfamilias, the male head of the state's household, held a legal power called patria potestas, which gave him authority over the lives of everyone in his family. When a child was born, the father had the legal right to acknowledge it and raise it, or to refuse. Refusal meant the infant was exposed, left outside, usually at a designated location. To die of exposure, or to be picked up by whoever found it first? This was not a rare practice. It was common. It was legal. It was documented extensively. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder described it without any particular moral commentary, because in his world, it required none. Seneca discussed it. Multiple Roman legal texts addressed the property rights of exposed children, who were later reclaimed. The practice was woven into the fabric of Roman family law so thoroughly that it generated its own body of legal precedent. The reasons for exposure were various. A child born with visible disabilities was frequently exposed. A child born into a family that could not afford another mouth was exposed. And this is the part that modern readers find most difficult. Female infants were exposed at significantly higher rates than male infants. A letter survives from the 1st century BC, written by a Roman man to his wife, instructing her that if she gives birth while he is away, she should raise the child if it is a boy, but expose it if it is a girl. The letter is written with affection. It contains declarations of love, and then it contains that instruction delivered in the same tone as the rest of the letter, because to the writer, it was simply a practical matter. A pregnant Roman woman, therefore, began her pregnancy knowing that the outcome depended partly on biology, partly on medicine, and partly on the decision of the man who headed her household. This shaped everything that followed, assuming the pregnancy was wanted, or at least accepted the next. Order of business was diagnosis, and understanding Roman medicine had a genuinely sophisticated understanding of human reproduction by ancient standards. The physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century AD, described the anatomy of pregnancy and childbirth with remarkable accuracy in some areas. Soranus of Ephesus, arguably the most important Roman gynecologist, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century AD, produced a text called Gynecology that remained a standard medical reference in Europe for over 1,000 years. Soranus described the stages of fetal development, discussed the management of difficult labors, addressed complications, and recommended specific practices for maternal health during pregnancy. Soranus also recommended, among other things, that pregnant women avoid violent emotions, excessive exercise, sexual intercourse during the 1st trimester, and salty foods. Some of this is medically reasonable. Some of it reflects the intersection of medicine and moral philosophy that characterized Roman medical thinking, the idea that the pregnant body was in a fragile state that required careful management of all inputs, physical and emotional. What Roman medicine got significantly wrong was the underlying theory of how Conception and fetal development actually worked. The dominant Roman medical theory held that the fetus was nourished by menstrual blood, which was retained in the womb during pregnancy, rather than being expelled monthly. This explained, in the Roman theoretical framework, why pregnant women did not menstruate. It also led to a range of dietary and behavioral recommendations based on the idea that the quality of the mother's blood directly determined the quality of the developing child, meaning that what a woman ate, felt, experienced, and thought during pregnancy could shape the child she was carrying. In quite direct ways, this belief was so strong that Roman medical writers recommended that pregnant women avoid looking at frightening or disturbing images, particularly during the early months, on the grounds that strong visual impressions could affect the developing child. A woman who saw something monstrous during pregnancy might, in the Roman theoretical framework, produce a child that bore some resemblance to what she had seen. This sounds absurd by modern standards. By Roman standards, it was a logical extension of a coherent, internally consistent medical theory. The practical experience of Roman pregnancy depended enormously on social class. A wealthy Roman woman, a matrona of the senatorial or equestrian class, had access to physicians, midwives, and a household staff capable of managing the practical demands of a monitored pregnancy. She could afford the dietary adjustments recommended by Soranus. She could rest when Galen recommended rest. She had access to the imported herbs and compounds that Roman pharmacology prescribed for various pregnancy complaints. She was also subject to a relentless social pressure to produce children specifically. Male children, specifically, legitimate children who could inherit property and continue the family line. The Roman state under Augustus had gone so far as to legislate around this pressure, passing the Lex Aelia de Maritandis Ordinabus, which penalized childless married couples through inheritance, restrictions, and rewarded women who produced 3 or more children with the ius trium librorum, the right of 3 children, which granted significant legal independence to women who had fulfilled their reproductive obligations to the state. Roman women were not merely expected to have children. They were legally incentivized to do so, legally penalized for not doing so, and socially judged extensively on the basis of their reproductive performance. A woman who produced healthy male children had discharged her primary social obligation. A woman who could not or did not was a source of family anxiety and social comment. A poor Roman woman, a plebeian in the densely packed insulate of the Subura, or a slave in a wealthy household experienced pregnancy entirely differently. Slave women had no legal standing over their pregnancies or their children. A child born to a slave woman was property belonging to the slave's owner. The owner could sell the child, keep it, or expose it as they saw fit. Slave women who were of childbearing age were sometimes encouraged or forced to become pregnant, specifically to produce more slaves. The children of enslaved women were a property asset. This is documented in Roman agricultural manuals, which discuss the management of enslaved workers with the same clinical practicality applied to livestock, the management of pregnancy. Symptoms in Rome was a mixture of the practical, the pharmacological, and the spectacular. Soranus recommended a relatively moderate diet during pregnancy. Not too rich, not too sparse, avoiding excessive salt, sharp flavors, and difficult to digest foods. He recommended gentle exercise, specifically walking. He recommended warm baths. He recommended massage with olive oil. This is reasonable. A modern obstetrician would not find much to quarrel with in the broad outlines of Soranus's dietary and exercise recommendations. What Soranus also recommended, along with virtually every other Roman medical writer, was an extensive pharmacological regime, involving substances that modern medicine would find deeply alarming. Lead was everywhere in Roman medicine and Roman daily life. Lead cooking vessels were used routinely. Lead plumbing delivered water to wealthy Roman homes. Lead acetate, a compound that tastes sweet, was used as a food additive and preservative. The Roman population was, by any modern measure, chronically exposed to lead at levels that caused significant neurological and physiological damage. Pregnant women were no exception. The physician, Galen, prescribed various compounds containing heavy metals for pregnancy-related conditions. Roman medical texts recommended poultices and preparations containing substances that modern toxicology would flag immediately. This was not malice or negligence. It was the state of knowledge available. In the 1st century AD, Romans did not know what lead did to the developing nervous system of a fetus because the concept of the nervous system as modern medicine understands, it did not exist in Roman medicine. For morning sickness, which Soranus described accurately as a common feature of early pregnancy, concentrated in the first trimester, Roman medicine recommended a range of interventions. Ginger preparations, pomegranate. Light foods that were easy to digest. Some of this is sensible. Romans had also discovered empirically that certain foods helped and certain foods made nausea worse, even without a theoretical framework to explain why. For the pain of pregnancy, back pain, pelvic pain, the various discomforts of a body accommodating a growing fetus, Roman medicine prescribed massage, heat, and various herbal preparations. Some of these were genuinely analgesic. The Roman pharmacological tradition had identified a range of plants with real medicinal properties, and some of what they prescribed for pregnancy pain would have actually worked. What happened at the moment of birth was in many ways the most dramatic and the most medically significant part of the Roman pregnancy. Experienced birth in Rome happened at home. There were no hospitals in the modern sense. Roman medical institutions, called valetudinaria, existed primarily for military use, for treating injured soldiers in the field. A civilian Roman woman giving birth did so in her home, attended by a midwife and by whatever female relatives and household members were present. The midwife, the obstetrix, was a trained professional. Soranus devoted significant space in his gynecology to the qualifications a good midwife should have. She should be literate, he said, so that she could read medical texts. She should have long fingernails trimmed, short for internal examinations. She should be strong enough to assist in physically demanding deliveries. She should be calm and not easily disturbed by the sight of blood or the sounds of a difficult labor. She should have good hands and know how to use them. The Roman midwife used a birthing stool, a curved chair with an open seat that allowed the laboring woman to be in a semi-upright position while the midwife worked from below and in front. This position, it turns out, is actually biomechanically sensible for labor and delivery. Romans arrived at it empirically, by observing what worked. What Roman midwives could not do was manage the complications that killed women and infants in significant numbers during ancient childbirth, hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, eclampsia. These were the killers. And against them, Roman medicine had limited defenses. Soranus described interventions for obstructed labor, including, in the most extreme cases, procedures to remove a dead fetus that had become lodged in the birth canal, with the frank clinical detail of someone who had seen these situations and was writing instructions for other practitioners who would also see them. The maternal mortality rate in ancient Rome was significant. Estimates vary, but historians working from skeletal evidence and documentary sources suggest that death in childbirth was a realistic risk that Roman women and their families understood and anticipated. Multiple Roman funerary inscriptions commemorate women who died in childbirth. Roman women made wills before delivering. Roman families offered prayers and sacrifices to Juno Lucina, the goddess of childbirth, before and during labor, not as a formality, but as genuine petitions to divine power at a moment when human medicine had real limits. If the birth went well, the child was born alive, healthy, and to a family that would acknowledge it, what happened in the days immediately following was a sequence of rituals that marked the transition from biological event to social fact. The newborn was placed on the ground immediately after birth. This was a ritual act. The father, if he was present, which was not required, would lift the child from the ground if he chose to acknowledge it. This gesture, The talere liberum was the formal act of paternal recognition. It transformed the child from a biological entity into a legal person with a place in the family. On the 8th day for girls, the 9th day for boys, a timing that reflected Roman numerological beliefs about male and female, the child was given its name in a ceremony called the dies lustricas, the day of purification. The child was formally named, was registered if the family was of citizen status, and received a bulla, a protective amulet, in a golden case for children of wealthy families. A leather case for poorer children that would be worn until adulthood. The bulla was not merely decorative. It was understood to have protective power, guarding the child against the evil eye and malevolent supernatural forces. This was taken seriously. Rome was a world in which supernatural threats to vulnerable children were real concerns, in which specific rituals existed to protect newborns from specific malevolent entities, in which the first weeks of life were understood to be a period of particular danger requiring particular ritual attention. The concern was not irrational. Infant mortality in ancient Rome was severe by modern standards. A significant percentage of children did not survive their first year. Families who had experienced repeated child loss, and many had, developed a complex relationship with infant vulnerability, expressed both through genuine grief and through practical emotional distancing. Roman families sometimes did not give children their full names until they had survived long enough to suggest they would continue surviving. What all of this amounts to is a picture of Roman pregnancy and childbirth that is simultaneously recognizable and alien recognizable, because the emotional landscape, the hope, the anxiety, the relief, the grief, is unchanged. A Roman woman watching her husband lift their newborn from the ground felt something that any parent would recognize. A Roman family celebrating the dies lustricus with relief that the child had survived the first week felt something that does not require translation. Alien. Because the frameworks within which those emotions operated, the legal structures, the medical theories, the supernatural beliefs, the social pressures, the naked economic calculations about which children were worth raising, those are not our frameworks. They were coherent. They were internally consistent. They produced a functioning society that lasted for centuries. And they were, by modern standards, built on assumptions about human life that we have replaced entirely. The Roman woman who drank the herbal preparation her midwife prescribed, who avoided looking at frightening things because she did not want her child to be affected, who prayed to Juno Lucina because she knew what happened when births went wrong, who waited for her husband to lift the child from the ground before she allowed herself to fully celebrate she was doing everything right by the standards of her world was just very different from ours, and that, more than any single fact about lead in the cooking pots or exposure rates for female infants, is the thing worth sitting with. The Romans were not primitive. They were not cruel by the standards of their time and place. They were people operating with the knowledge, beliefs, and social structures available to them, trying to bring new life into the world as safely and successfully as they could. They just did it in ways that would have surprised you considerably. If you had been watching, what's the most surprising thing you learned about ancient Rome? Drop it in the comments. Until next time.